If you've got a Jeep JL Wrangler and are looking to install a small lift on it, this episode of the JL Journal will show you how. Today, we'll be installing a 2.5-inch EVO budget boost on our Jeep JL Wrangler Rubicon Unlimited, but the process should pretty much be the same for any lift of this size and type. Now, a budget boost is just a cost-effective way of giving your JL a little bit of a lift, and it does so by placing spacers like these on top of your factory coils. This particular kit also comes with front and rear bump stop extensions, and what they do is they help prevent the overcompression of your coils, the bottoming out of your shocks, and the rubbing of your fenders through excessive upward travel. For our purposes, we also elected to get a set of front and rear shock extensions so that we could reuse the factory shocks and save a little bit of money. This kit also came with new rear sway bar links, as we'll be using the factory rear links up front. Because we know that we'll be running taller coils, longer shocks, or even coilover someday, we decided that it'd be smart to plan ahead and get all 8 optional control arms that EVO offers with their kit. As you can see here, they are super beefy, fully adjustable, and have johnnie joints on both ends as well. In addition to allowing us to dial in our suspension, set our caster and pinion angles, these new control arms will also allow us to have a greater degree of bind-free flex. Before we remove anything from our JL, we're going to go ahead and prepare all these control arms to be installed. To start off, we're going to remove all the johnnie joints from the control arms so that we can apply a bit of anti-seize to them to prevent future corrosion and make it easier to adjust in the future. Okay, so we're going to get this down. Apply a little bit of anti-seize here. Put a little bit down here as well. Just work it in and reinstall. Now, according to the instructions that EVO provided, these front lower control arms should be set to 24 1/8 inch. So what we're going to do, set this on its side, and then we're going to be measuring from eye to eye on all these joints. So right now, looks like it's actually dead on. I got lucky. 24 1/8 inch right there. So once that's in, we're going to take this jam nut and just hand tighten it up, and we're also going to make sure that both the Zurich nipples are pointing in the same direction. On the front upper control arms, you want to make sure that the open end on the axle mount is facing downward with the Zurich nipple that you see here. See, this one is 20 1/4. Okay, so the rear uppers say they should be 17 1/2, and right now we're about 17 and a little more than 5/8. Bring this in a bit. There you go, looks like 17 1/2 right there. Bring up this jam nut. 19 3/4 right there. So now that all the control arms are set, it's time to get working on our JL. Alright, now we're ready to start working on this lift. So to begin, you want to make sure that your Jeep is parked on a nice, safe, and level surface. And then for our purposes, I'm going to go ahead and take off the skid plate that you see here, or the air dam, so that we can have more access to things like the track bar and the sway bar links. So using a 13mm socket, I'm going to go ahead few rocks in there. So there are a couple components that are a lot easier to remove with the full weight of the Jeep on the ground, and the first of which is the track bar. Now we're going to want to remove the track bar, at least the bolt at the axle, so that when the Jeep is up in the air, we can droop the axle down far and just pull the coils right out. So to do that, we're going to use a 21mm socket and then come right in here, and you can see that Jeep made this nice bend in the drag link, so you can get a nice ratchet extension in there. The other components that we're going to remove are the sway bar links. For those of you who've had to disconnect your sway bars on the trail, as you know, it's a lot easier to do when you're on level ground. Using an 18mm socket and wrench, we're just going to go ahead and remove this bolt now. The cool thing about the passenger side is that the sway bar link physically ties into the track bar mount and has a flag nut to hold everything in place, so all you need is a ratchet on that end right there. Okay, rotate this whole thing out of the way. We're definitely lucky enough to have a lift to work on our JL, but it isn't really required. You can definitely install a lift with a simple floor jack, or two if you have it, and a set of jack stands. After you have the front end of your Jeep raised up from the axle, you can set the frame rails back down on a set of jack stands like these. This is a 6-ton jack stand that I picked up at Harbor Freight, and you can locate them just behind the skid bar that you can see here, or in our case we're using our lift, and this is where it would go. Okay, so now that your Jeep's up in the air, we're going to go ahead and remove the wheels. And in order to do that, you're going to need a 22mm socket to get the lever. Alright, so now that we have our wheels off, I just took a little bit of the weight of the axle off using this floor jack. And now we're going to go ahead and remove the lower bolts securing the shock to the axle. We're going to use an 18mm socket and wrench. Because we're going to be installing a set of shock extension, the lower mount is the only thing that we need to remove. Next, we're going to use a 15mm socket to remove the nut securing this bracket attached to your lower control arm that's also holding your ABS and brake line in place. And then we're going to take a 10mm socket and remove the small bolt holding the brake line and ABS to the frame. So I've been removing all these components that you've been seeing so that I can lower this axle as far as possible. This will make it a lot easier to pull the coil right out without having to use a spring compressor or otherwise. So there's one additional wire that we want to make sure that we grab just in case. And while it may not be necessary, I'm going to go ahead and unplug the electric locker plug, which has this little gray tab that you need to squeeze in order to pull it out. And then you're going to want to use a pry tool like this to free the wiring harness from the upper control arm. There is actually one more tab up on the frame rail that we're going to pull off now as well. Okay, just like on the driver's side, we're going to go ahead and remove this wiring harness. That's for the FAD, using our pry tool to pop it out. And then there's one more up on the frame rail that we're going to get as well. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and disconnect the FAD plug, which you'll have to push on this red tab as you pull out. Okay, so now we're going to remove this tab as well. So with everything disconnected, now it's time to lower the axle. So I'm going to go ahead and do this slowly, one side at a time. As it's coming down, you want to double check to make sure there's nothing getting hung up. Looks good so far. So far so good. I think we've got enough clearance. You can see here the coils physically off of the upper spring perch. This is the rubber isolator that goes up on top. So now we have enough room to just lift up pull out. That easy. Now we can take out the rubber isolator, which we will be reusing. If we were installing just a basic budget boost, we'd almost be done. But because we decided to get new control arms, we're going to replace them now. So we're going to start with the lower driver's side control arm, and we're just going to replace one at a time. It's the fastest and easiest way to do it, and it'll help make sure that your axle doesn't move around too much. To remove the factory lower control arm, we're going to need a 21mm socket and a 24mm wrench on the back side. But since I don't have one, I'm just going to use a crescent wrench. So now we're going to go ahead and install the EVO arm in its place.
It's a tight fit getting the factory bolts installed, and a few taps with a hammer will be needed to help get them through. Being that the EVO control arms have johnnie joints, everything can be tightened up now, but I'll still hold off on giving them a final torque until the full weight of the JL is back on the ground. The front upper control arms have heat shields that are held in place with 2 bolts, and a 10mm socket will be needed to remove them. An 18mm socket and wrench will be needed to remove the upper control arm bolts. Space is limited at the frame mount, and you will need to use a ratchet here. Okay, so our new EVO upper control arms can now be installed, and as you can see, Jeep added a nice viewing port on the side of the frame rail, and that makes it a lot easier to get things going. Being that the upper control arm frame bolts will be a lot harder to get to later, I'll go ahead and tighten them down now to torque spec. Because the axle mount joints are made out of bonded rubber, they will need to be tightened to torque spec once the full weight of the JL is back on the ground. Heat shields can now be reinstalled. Using a 1 7/8" wrench, the lower control arm jam nuts can now be tightened. A 1.5" wrench will be needed for the upper control arm jam nuts. To begin the installation of the EVO coil spacers, slip one of the provided bolts and washers through the existing hole on the upper spring perch.
So we're going to go in.
The EVO coil spacer can now be slipped up the bump stop tower.
Want to make sure that bolt goes right through this.
After installing one of the provided washers and stovers, tighten everything down with a 7/16" socket and wrench. Use a pair of dikes to cut the nubs off the rubber isolator, and then slide it up the bump stop tower to the base of the coil spacer.
We're going to take our bolt and washer, pop it in here. We're going to place it on the bottom side of the spring. Then we're going to put this up together. And then make sure this point right here, the bottom of the coil, needs to be indexed to this isolator right there. And take the stover.
A 9/16" wrench and socket attached to a ratchet extension will be needed to secure the bump stop extension to the axle. Use the factory bolt to install the EVO front brake line extension bracket to the frame. Then, Use the provided bolt and nylock nut to secure the brake line to the bracket. A 10mm socket will be needed for the frame bolt, and a 7/16" socket and wrench will be needed for the new hardware.
So bolt and washer, stick it in here, go through that hole.
Use a 9/16" wrench and socket attached to a ratchet extension to secure the EVO shock relocation bracket to the axle mount.
Okay. So we're going to take a crush sleeve, hold it in there, and use the factory bolt, slip it through, take the factory nut, let's take our 18mm wrench and socket.
This bolt should now be tightened to torque spec. Using a pair of vice grips to hold the brake hose bracket, carefully drill out the mounting hole so that it's now a 1/2 inch in size.
Looks good.
Carefully raise the axle a bit to help get the shock aligned with the mounting hole.
Edge of the coil, we want to make sure that it's terminating correctly. Washer on.
The brake hose bracket can now be installed onto the shock bolt. A 3/4 inch socket and wrench will be needed to fasten the new hardware, and a torque wrench will be needed to tighten everything down to torque spec. The wiring for the FAD can now be plugged back in, and the wiring for the front locker can be plugged back in as well.
That's in. Good. In preparation for the rear, the last thing we're going to do is we're going to take off the front sway bar links.
Before we can finish things up, our new wheels and tires will need to be installed. Using a 22mm socket, you'll want to tighten the lug nuts to torque spec.
Alright, so we've got our wheels and tires installed and the full weight of the vehicle is on the ground. What we're going to do now is reinstall the track bar, which helps to be on the ground, and we're going to go through and tighten all our bolts to torque spec. The control arms, basically, in the track bar. So that's what we're going to do before we move to the rear. So as you can see here, the track bar is going to be a little bit hard to line, so we're going to have a helper go inside and turn the steering wheel and help me to get that bolt set up. Okay, turn a little bit, driver. A little bit more. A little bit more. Keep going. Keep going. Hang on right there. Hold it right there.
Using a 21mm socket and long ratchet extension, the track bar bolt should now be tightened to torque spec. The upper control arm axle mount bolts can now be tightened to torque spec. And finally, the lower control arm bolts should now be tightened to torque spec. Moving to the back of our JL, the very first bolt I'll remove is the one for the track bar. Just like up front, a 21mm socket will be needed for this. Using an 18mm wrench and socket, the bolt securing the sway bar link to the axle can now be removed as well. After raising our JL back up off the ground, the wheels and tires can now come off. Just like up front, you'll want to use a floor jack to help support the weight of your axle. An 18mm socket will be needed to remove the links off the sway bar. And an 18mm socket and wrench will be needed to disconnect the shock from the axle. Push down on the gray tab and unplug the wiring for the rear locker. With everything disconnected, the axle can now be carefully lowered. And, as you can see, the coils can now be removed with very little effort. Being that we will be installing new EVO adjustable control arms, the factory ones can now be removed. Using a 21mm wrench and socket, the lower arms will be the first to go.
Making sure that the zerks are pointing up.
The EVO lower control arms can now be installed onto the frame mount. To help hold everything in place, partially slide the control arm up into the axle mount and then use a 1 7/8 inch wrench to tighten up the jam nut.
Okay.
The EVO lower control arm can now be secured to the axle using the factory hardware. Being that the upper control arms use flag nuts, a 21mm socket will be all that you need to remove the bolts. Again, making sure that the zerks are pointing up, the EVO upper control arms can now be installed. Securing the upper control arm to the frame used to be a tough job, but at least on the driver's side of a JL, a viewing port will help make things a lot easier. Thanks to the gas tank being in the way, the passenger side frame bolt will be a bit more of a challenge to get in.
So of all the control arm bolts on the rear end, the one on the passenger side upper control arm is the hardest to get back in because you can't actually see the flag nut as you put it in. On the driver's side, there's a port that you can physically watch you coming through, but on this side, you can't. The one thing that you need to know is that this hole that you're sticking in, it's a rectangle, but as you can see, the flagged nut is actually at an angle. If you try to get the bolt started flush or parallel with the hole, it'll never happen. You kind of have to be at this slight angle.
With all the new EVO control arms installed, the bolts can now be tightened up, but as before, I'll hold off on doing a final torque until the JL is back on the ground. That is, with the exception of the upper control arms, as the axle side bolts will be very difficult to work on.
So now we're ready to install the rear coil spacers, and the way they're going to go up is with this flat plate pushed up, and in this case, this is a driver's side. You could tell because it's got this radius here, and this is going to go up into the spring perch like this. So we're going to take our assortment of hardware that comes with this, put a washer on the bolt, and this is going to go through the frame and then through here, and then we'll come up with a washer and nut. I'm showing you all this ahead of time because once it's up there, it's going to be a little bit harder to film.
A 5/8 inch wrench and socket will be needed to secure the coil spacer to the upper spring perch.
Okay, first we want to make sure that the upper rubber isolator is indexed accordingly, right there. With this indexed on the coil and the little rubber nub here, we're going to reach up, make sure that it's lining up into that little hole.
A pry bar may be needed to help get the coil in.
So now we're going to install our rear bump stop extensions. Drop in bolts and washers.
After making sure that the bump stop extension is angled toward the front, it can now be secured to the axle using a pair of 1/2-inch wrenches. Before moving on, the upper control arm jam nuts should now be tightened using a 1.5-inch wrench. To begin the installation of the EVO rear shock relocation bracket, the existing hole on the lower control arm mount will need to be drilled out to 3/8 of an inch.
Okay. Taking this bolt here, just kind of sticking it in just to kind of hold everything in place.
Using the relocation bracket as a template, the position of the lowest hole can now be marked with a center punch.
Put a little bit of cutting oil.
Use a smaller drill bit or unibit to create a pilot hole, and then follow it up with a 3/8-inch drill bit. The EVO shock relocation bracket can now be installed.
It's going to fit. Slipping this washer and this stover up and in one at a time. So then I'm going to take a 9/16 wrench and a 9/16 socket.
Using a piece of duct tape to help hold the stover to the open end of a 9/16-inch wrench, carefully slide it between the axle tube and the control arm mount, and then secure the bracket in place. A 9/16-inch socket will also be needed to help tighten everything down.
Okay, so we're going to take just a little bit of grease, really just a smear, to kind of help make this easier to go in.
A bench vise will be needed to press the bushings into the EVO sway bar links.
Okay. Do the same with the crush sleeves. Just put a little bit on. Get it started. There you go. All assembled.
Using the hardware provided, the assembled EVO links can now be installed onto the rear sway bar. A 19mm wrench and socket will be needed to secure them in place. Using the factory bolt and nut, the EVO sway bar link can now be installed onto the axle mount. As you can see, the bolt will pass through the shock relocation bracket as well. An 18mm wrench and socket will be needed to tighten everything down. Using a floor jack, carefully raise the rear axle just enough so that the shock lines up with the mounting hole. It can now be secured in place with the factory bolt and nut. An 18mm wrench and socket will be needed to fasten everything down. The locker wiring can now be plugged in again.
Let's move the e-brake cable out of the way and then pull those guys out. What that should do is give us just a little bit more slack in the wiring harness for the e-locker.
To help keep the wiring in place, I'll loosely zip tie it to the e-brake cable.
So because this thing's got all this bind, I'm going to go ahead and loosen the other side.
Unlike up front, the rear track bar has bonded rubber bushings on both ends, and the frame side bolt will need to be loosened up a bit to free it of bind. A 21mm wrench end socket will be needed to help loosen up the bolt. Our new wheels and tires can now be installed. As before, a 22mm socket will be needed to tighten up the lug nuts to torque spec.
Okay. So now we're going to be installing the rear sway bar links up on the front axle. As you can see, it's actually identical to what was on the front axle before, only a lot longer. So it makes a perfect fit.
Using the factory hardware, an 18mm socket will be needed to help secure everything in place.
Coming down. There you have it. Our EVO 2.5-inch lifted JL. I think it looks amazing. So with the full weight of the Jeep on the ground, you can see that our track bar is off maybe about 1/2 of an inch. So I'm going to go out and push on the side of the body, and you'll see the track bar come in.
Okay, that's probably more than enough. Yeah, that's almost perfect.
Okay, cool.
This way?
Yep, perfect.
Using a 21mm socket, the track bar bolts can now be tightened to torque spec. Again, using a 21mm socket and wrench, all the control arm bolts can now be tightened to torque spec as well. Finally, the position of the steering wheel will be off a bit, and to recenter it, the drag link will need to be adjusted. Use a 15mm wrench to loosen up the clamp on the drag link adjuster. Rotate the adjuster as needed until the steering wheel is centered.
Yeah, that's correct. That's good.
And then, retighten the nut on the adjuster clamp. I should note, this may take more than once to get it right. To see a written version of this write-up, complete with tons of detailed photos and everything before, during, and after the install, simply click on the link you see here.
So that's what it takes to install an EVO 2.5-inch budget boost, complete with 8 adjustable control arms. We hope you found this video useful. If you're not already a member, we would love for you to come by jlwrangler.com and become a part of our online community. Until next time, we'll see you again here on the JL Journal.